The water was black, swallowing her whole. I stood on the shore, frozen, watching her arms flail against waves that wanted her dead. 3 years I'd been alone in that cabin. 3 years of silence, 3 years of making sure I never cared about anyone again. But her scream cut through everything I'd built, and before my brain could tell me all the reasons to stay safe, my body was already moving. The ice-cold water hit like a fist. She went under. I dove deeper. My lungs burned. My fear screamed, and in that moment, pulling her lifeless body toward shore, I had no idea I wasn't just saving her life, I was saving my own. The cabin sat on the edge of Montana's wilderness like a forgotten prayer, weathered pine logs dark with age and rain. Silas had chosen this place 3 years ago for one reason. It was far enough from civilization that no one would bother looking for him. The nearest town, Polson, was 18 miles south, and he made the drive only when his supplies ran dangerously low. He preferred the silence, the loneliness. It was safer that way. The afternoon sky had turned the color of bruised plums, clouds rolling in from the western mountains with the speed of something angry. Silas stood on his porch, coffee mug cooling in his hands, watching the storm approach across Flathead Lake. The water churned grey and violent, whitecaps forming where there had been glass-smooth surface just an hour before. At 42, Silas had learned to read Montana weather like a man reads his own heartbeat. This storm would be bad. He was about to head inside when he saw her, a figure in the water too far from shore, arms thrashing against waves that seemed intent on pulling her under. His coffee mug hit the porch with a crack. Every instinct screamed at him to look away, to go inside, to not get involved. That's what he'd been doing for 3 years. Not getting involved, not connecting, not risking the pain that comes when you care about someone and they disappear from your life. But her head went under, came back up, went under again. The scream that tore from his throat surprised him. His legs were already moving, boots pounding down the rocky path to the shore. The water was ice-cold, fed by mountain snowmelt even in late summer. He dove in anyway, the shock of it stealing his breath, his fear of deep water suddenly irrelevant against the image of that woman sinking beneath the surface. The waves fought him with every stroke. Silas hadn't swum in years, not since before the accident, and his muscles burned with the effort. The woman had gone under again, and panic clawed at his chest as he pushed forward, lungs screaming for air. The storm's roar filled his ears, rain pelting his face so hard it felt like needles. His hand found fabric. He grabbed, pulled, kicked with everything he had. Her body was limp, dead weight in his arms as he struggled back toward shore. A wave crashed over them both, and for a terrifying moment he thought they'd both drown. His foot found purchase on a submerged rock, and he used it to launch them forward. Another stroke. Another. The shore was impossibly far. When his knees finally hit sand, he dragged her onto the narrow beach, collapsing beside her. She wasn't breathing. Years of mandatory first aid training from his old life as a construction foreman kicked in. He tilted her head back, checked her airway, and began compressions. 30 counts, 2 breaths, 30 more. His hands shook. "Come on," he gasped between breaths. "Come on, damn it." She convulsed, water pouring from her mouth as she coughed and gasped. Her eyes flew open, wild with terror and confusion. She was young, maybe mid-20s, with dark hair plastered to a face that was turning from blue to pale pink as oxygen returned. She tried to speak, but only more coughing came out. "Don't talk," Silas said, his voice rougher than he intended. "Can you walk?" She nodded weakly. He half carried her up the path to his cabin, the storm now fully unleashed around them. Lightning split the sky, thunder following so close it shook the ground. They burst through his door, and he lowered her onto the old couch near the wood stove. She was shivering violently, soaked clothes clinging to her thin frame. "I'll get you dry clothes," he muttered, already moving toward his bedroom. When he returned with sweatpants and a flannel shirt, she was staring at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Gratitude, maybe, or shock. Probably both. Her name was Tessa, and she had nowhere to go. That much became clear over the next few days as she recovered in his cabin. She'd been hiking alone, she said, got caught in the storm, slipped on wet rocks, and fell into the lake. Her rental car had been parked at a trailhead miles away, and when Silas drove her there 3 days later, it was gone. Towed or stolen, didn't matter which. Her phone had been destroyed by the water, her wallet too. She had no family she could call, no friends in Montana. She'd been traveling alone, running from something she wouldn't talk about. "I can take you to town," Silas offered, uncomfortable with her presence but bound by some sense of responsibility. "Polson has a sheriff's station. They can help you." Tessa shook her head. "Not yet, please. Just a few more days." Those few days became a week, then 2. Silas found himself strangely unable to force the issue. She was quiet, respectful of his space, but always there. When he chopped wood, she appeared with water. When he made coffee at dawn, she was already awake, sitting on the porch watching the sunrise. When he drove to town for supplies, she came along, silent in the passenger seat, then helped carry everything inside. "Why are you doing this?" he finally asked one evening, frustration breaking through his carefully maintained walls. They were sitting on the porch, the summer air heavy with the scent of pine and wood smoke from his stove. "Following me everywhere. You don't owe me anything." Tessa was quiet for a long moment, hands wrapped around a mug of tea. "You saved my life when you didn't have to, when you could have just stayed inside and pretended you didn't see." Her voice was soft but steady. "I've been alone for a long time, Silas. Before the lake, before Montana, and you're the first person in years who did something good without wanting anything back. I guess I'm not ready to leave that behind yet." Her words hit something in him he'd thought was dead. He looked away, jaw tight. The change happened slowly, so gradually that Silas didn't notice until it had already transformed his life. Tessa started cooking meals instead of just eating what he made. She organized his chaotic shelves of books and supplies. She asked questions about his life before the cabin, gentle probing that he deflected at first, then slowly, reluctantly, began to answer. He told her about the construction accident that had killed 2 of his crew members 5 years ago, how he'd been the foreman, how he'd approved the scaffold that collapsed, how the lawsuits and guilt had destroyed his marriage and his career, how he'd come to Montana to disappear, to stop being a person who could fail others. "You saved me," Tessa said simply when he finished. They were fishing at the lake, the same lake where he'd pulled her from the water a month ago. The scene was peaceful now, surface mirror-smooth under a cloudless sky. That doesn't sound like someone who fails people. That was different. That was instinct. Instinct is who you really are, she countered. When there's no time to think, no time to be afraid. You ran into that water when you were terrified of it. That's not failure. That's courage. Silas felt something crack inside his chest, some wall he'd built brick by brick over 3 years of isolation. Tessa wasn't pushing him toward anything. She was just there, steady and present, showing him through her quiet persistence that connection didn't have to end in loss. One afternoon, a truck pulled up to his cabin. Owen, a rancher from the nearest property 5 miles east, climbed out with a case of beer and a grin. "Heard you had company. Thought I'd come by and say hello. Been trying to get you to come to town for cards for 2 years, Silas." Silas glanced at Tessa, who smiled encouragingly. "Maybe next week," he heard himself say. The words felt foreign but not wrong. By the time autumn painted the Montana mountains in gold and red, Tessa had been with Silas for 3 months. She'd found work at a diner in Polson, saving money for her own place, but every evening she came back to the cabin. They'd fallen into a rhythm, comfortable and healing. She'd coax him into town for community dinners. He'd teach her to fish and maintain the cabin's aging infrastructure. They talked for hours on the porch, sharing stories and silences alike. "I got approved for an apartment," Tessa said one cool October evening. She didn't sound happy about it. In Polson, I can move in next week. Silas felt the panic rise before he could stop it. The cabin would be empty again, silent again. He'd convinced himself that isolation was safety, but Tessa had shown him the difference between being alone and being lonely. Without her, he'd go back to just surviving instead of living. Or, he said carefully, you could stay. Not forever if you don't want, but there's plenty of room, and I could use help with winter preparations. Montana winters are brutal if you don't know what you're doing. Tessa's smile started slow and spread like sunrise. You asking me to stick around, Silas? Yeah, I guess I am. She nodded, eyes bright. Then I'm staying. That evening, Silas stood on his porch watching the lake turn silver in the fading light. 3 years ago, he'd come here to hide from the world, convinced that isolation was the only way to protect himself from more loss. Then a storm had brought someone into his life who refused to let him disappear. Tessa hadn't just followed him because of gratitude. She'd followed him because she understood that broken people could help each other heal. The cabin didn't feel like a hiding place anymore. It felt like home. And when Tessa joined him on the porch with 2 mugs of coffee, shoulder-brushing his in comfortable silence, Silas realized that courage wasn't just about diving into freezing water to save a stranger. It was about letting someone stay, about choosing connection over safety, about believing that the people you save might just save you right back. The Montana wind carried the scent of coming snow. And for the first time in years, Silas didn't dread the isolation of winter. He wouldn't be facing it alone.